Hey everybody, so I went ahead and clicked on start record. So this is the first lecture of a new semester in the C# development class. And so brand new class, ground zero, never, presumably no one's written C# before, or if you have, it's you know, not a ton of experience. Maybe I'm wrong about that, but that's what this class is all about. We're going to get you from no experience to experienced, at least to the point where, students who've graduated this class, graduated from this program, go out and get C# jobs. And in fact, it's a common language to gain employment with. This is oftentimes a thing that I like to show if I look at a developer survey from Stack Overflow. So this is a survey that's done every year. And each year there's, give or take a number of developers, roughly on average about 100,000 developers that take this survey. So it's a big, wide survey. As far as, it's the biggest survey that I know of. And you can see this year, 80,000 developers were surveyed. So big developer survey. And if you dig down into this, you can. There's a lot of information here, but the ones that I always like to look at, if you look at the technology, and maybe you look at most popular technologies, and so let's click on professional developers. You can kind of see where C# is falling in the list. Now, our curriculum at Rankin is JavaScript focused. Okay, this is one of the rare semesters that we're not writing a lot of JavaScript. So the number one language there, JavaScript, we got that box checked because you're going to have a lot of JavaScript by the time you graduate. HTML and CSS, we hit that last semester. For some of you, it will be next semester. So we've got that box checked. SQL, we hit that in multiple semesters as well. So check. Python is one that is certainly has been gaining a lot of popularity. Python's kind of been on our list. And if I look at this just even a year ago, C# used to be above Python. Not that long ago, Python's been really gaining momentum for various reasons, and so that is on our list of things that maybe we need to take a closer look at. TypeScript is a library in JavaScript. So again, if you're learning JavaScript, TypeScript is a JavaScript library. Node is another JavaScript library. We focus on Node, so we've got Node. Java, we cover that, and we cover C#. And so when you're looking at this list, we check a lot of these top boxes, right? So a lot of our graduates get jobs in C#. It is a language that has been around for about 20 years now. Microsoft created it, I believe, in 2002. And in recent history, it's lost a little bit. It's lost a little bit of momentum. But certainly there's a lot of jobs out there. You can dig down deeper into this, but I just like to show basically what do professional developers use. And so C#, in fact, I talked to a lot of alumni, and I think like the last 2 or 3 alumni that I talked to, I asked, what technologies do you work with? And the last couple of them, 2 to 3, 4, I don't know, they were saying C# on a daily basis. I work with C#. So that survey is a very comprehensive survey all across America. But St. Louis market is different than the American market, right? So Python is a very popular language, but it's kind of like fashion. If you think of fashion, it's really popular on the coasts first, and then it finally works its way to the Midwest like 10 years later. Technology is actually the same way. It starts in Silicon Valley and New York, and even Miami's gaining a lot of traction. It kind of starts on the outskirts and works its way in. So my observation is that there's even more C# jobs here in the Midwest because Python and these newer, trendier languages haven't quite made their way here in massive numbers yet. It's not to say that it's not changing every day, because it does. So C# is a Microsoft language. It's a single member in a family of Microsoft languages. Microsoft has a family of languages. That family is called .NET. And so .NET is a family of Microsoft languages, of which C# is a single language. So if you've ever heard of .NET, .NET again is a family of languages that are used to create apps. It's one of the more popular, because there's other ones, I think J# and F#. There's other .NET languages that just don't have the popularity, and I don't know that they ever will. They never really quite have. But there are other ones. The other big one that I'm not remembering, but I just remembered, would be VB, Visual Basic. So VB was really popular for a long time, and there were versions of VB. So it was VB6 before 2000, and then VB.NET after 2000. So VB.NET was another .NET language. So that's a little bit about C#. That's why C# is important. There's a lot of professional, good-paying jobs in C#. Arguably, and I tend to agree with this, it has lost a little momentum. Like, I remember when I first started teaching C#, it was like 2008. Been teaching it for a long time. It was the hot language. It's lost a little bit of steam, but it's still up there, right? And still relevant. In order to build C# applications, the tool is Visual Studio. And so this first lecture is over Visual Studio, how to use Visual Studio. Visual Studio always changes its year. So it's Visual Studio Community. That's the free one. That's the one you've all downloaded. Visual Studio Community. This year's 2022. So there's Visual Studio Community 2022. I imagine at some point we'll dive into what are the new features of Visual Studio 2022. But for the most part, I mean, there's very little changes as far as the basic structure and how Visual Studio Community works. I've pinned it to my taskbar. This little purple icon down here is Visual Studio Community 2022. Last semester, we used a different tool called Visual Studio Code. Okay, Visual Studio Code is a different, what's called IDE. It's a different tool for building different things besides C# desktop apps. Okay, we are building C# applications that can run on the desktop. We're literally creating executable files for Windows. We're creating .exes. And to install the .exes, you literally copy and paste the exe, and I can take it from my computer to yours and run this code. But with C#, it's important to mention C# is also used for web applications. Okay, and there's what's called .NET Core, C-O-R-E. .NET Core uses C# to build web applications, and web applications are the way of the future, and there's a lot of .NET Core jobs out there. .NET Core is the latest way to build web forms, or web applications, web apps I should say. Okay, but we're building Windows forms, right? Executables. And so when I go through this, it's like, okay, we got slides, and I use these slides as my reference, but I'm certainly, and I never want to be a teacher just reads off the slides. Okay, you know how to read. And I ask that you read the book. If you read the book, the slides are right from the book. Okay, so I'm not going to read this to you, but what I'm going to do is show you how to use this stuff. Okay, so I'll just start by opening Visual Studio, and I get a little launch screen, and this is what it looks like. So you can see here, open recent. There's nothing in recent for me to open because I just installed this. Clone a repository. No, we don't need to clone a repository. We've already done that, actually. Open a project or solution. If you've already created something, then you can later open it. But we haven't created anything yet, so we're not going to open it. And we're not going to open a local folder because that's not it either. We need to create something. So in Visual Studio, you create what are called projects. Projects are where you're going to write your code. When you have the basic structure is this. It's a very basic structure. You've got a project, and you can have multiple projects. And projects go into a solution. So you got one solution for each chapter, let's say. So chapter 2 solution. And then you can have 10 projects inside of the chapter 2 solution. So multiple projects go inside of a solution. That's the basic structure. So let's go ahead and create a project. And when you create a project for the first time, you will also create a solution. Because again, a project goes in a solution. Now, drop-down list here, of course we can filter by C#. So let's go ahead and do that. And what we're looking at here are called templates. So when we installed Visual Studio, we checked the box that made sure that we have all of these templates. Remember I said that's a really important box, that box I was talking about? If you miss that box, you're not going to have these templates. Okay, so that's why you got to check that box so you have the templates that we're going to work out of. There's two kinds of templates that we're going to use in this class. The first kind is a console app. The first kind is a console app. The second kind is a Windows Form app in the .NET framework. Okay, so I'll just go ahead and create a console app for the first time here. Now, the location is important. Remember where my repos were? My location was not in this directory. Remember I cloned my repo and I cloned it into my documents? So I'm actually going to change this. And I'm going to go into Documents, GitHub, All Student Repos, EA Gudmested. I'm just going to put this in my lab folder. And I'm going to select, actually I'm just going to select the lab folder. So this location, I selected the lab folder. You notice I did not select a folder underneath it. It's not the end of the world if you select lab 2 at this point, because what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create, you notice the subfolders here are CH and then the number. So my solution name, I'll say CH02. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a solution in that folder. And my project name, I'll just call this Lab 1. So the solution is the Chapter 2 folder. Now, by the way, do you think, what if I don't name it exactly CH02? What it'll do is it'll create a new folder. Like if I call it CH2, then it'll create a new folder called CH2. But if I name it CH02, it'll just use the folder that's already there. Okay, so I'm going to use the folder that's already there. I'm going to name it, the solution is going to be CH02. My project is going to be named Lab 1. And there are different versions of the .NET framework. This is actually the only option you got, .NET 6. Let's go ahead and click Create. This console application is actually, the file is called program.cs, and you can see it does console.writeline, hello world. When you're learning a new language, the tradition is to do hello world first. Like, just get the screen to say something is what that means. I just want to get the screen to say something. The way to run this is you click Start Without Debugging. So you click on the Debug menu, Start Without Debugging, or you can see the hotkey is Control F5. And there we've got a command prompt window that says Hello World. Now, let's walk through what we're looking at here. This is an application that runs via command prompt. Anybody in here old enough to remember the old days of DOS? Anybody like install DOS, work in DOS? Like in the old days, before Windows, before Bill Gates made this graphical tool where you can click a mouse and run programs, right? Bill Gates made a command line operating system. That command line operating system was called DOS, and you used to type in commands to run things. And so command prompts are typically just tools for developers that can be useful. They could be useful for automating things. You could, build scripts and batch files and command lines. Command prompts can be useful. Got Mr. Smith walking in here. Maybe. Hey, Mr. Smith, how are we doing? So command prompts are definitely useful tools for developers. Okay? When you're building apps, most of the time you look at a command prompt, you're like, no one's going to use this. And that's true. Like, this doesn't look like anything that any user would ever really use, right? That's a very good criticism. Command prompts are really good sometimes for teaching programming concepts. And so if you learn a programming concept in the command prompt, they can be useful tools. But then you apply them to graphical applications, right? Things with text boxes and labels and such. Okay? So we will use these command line apps as a tool for learning programming concepts throughout this course, but we will also build apps that you could actually use and they look like you would be used, right? Of course, you can kind of see, hello world. You could add some exclamation points. Click to save, file save. And then again, Control F5 runs it, and then you've got, you can mess with things, right? And then if you go like this, Visual Studio is actually smart enough to break this up into 2 lines and add a plus between these lines. New feature, by the way, it does that automatically. That's kind of cool. So now you run it. You notice even though I broke it up in my code, the output is just the same. So Visual Studio just kind of made it work there for us. That's nice. Once you've created a solution, remember the process I went through. I just showed you the process of creating a solution. Here's my project. The project is called Lab 1. Multiple projects go in a solution. Well, I don't need to create another solution. Presumably, we're still in Chapter 2. We're still in a Chapter 2 lecture. So if I want to create another coding exercise, I just need to add a project to my solution. Okay, so you all saw how to create a solution, and in that solution you create your first project. Okay, once you've done that though, you just continue to add projects. Okay, the way to add projects, once you've done it once, you right click the solution, click add new project. Okay, I'll just call this lab 2. Now again, I come to this screen. There's two options, one or the other that you're going to click here. Let's filter for C#. And then we're either going to click on Console App if we're creating a command line application, or, and I'll do this now, we're going to click on Windows Form App of the .NET Framework. This is our GUI. So let's go ahead and click on Windows Form App, .NET Framework. Next. The project name, now you notice there's no solution. We already have a solution. I'll just call this Lab 2. Now take a look here. The first thing to notice, Lab 1 is still in bold. Lab 1 is still bold. Lab 2 is not bolded. That means if I hit debug, start without debugging, you notice it's running my command line. Okay, so this drop-down box right here, it changes the startup project. So I've got two projects, and I just got to change this drop-down list here to change which one I run. So now if I hit debug, start without debugging, now I've got a little Windows form, right? And now this looks like something that's the start of something that could be used. Okay, so let's go back to Visual Studio. And now we're creating desktop apps. And if you really are curious, and if you go into your lab folder, this is kind of good to know at the beginning. Go into your lab folder. Here's my CH02. Notice it's creating some files in here for me. Right? And if I go into lab 2, you actually got to dig a little bit. You go into bin, debug. There's your executable. Literally an executable that you can double click and run what you've created. So remember I said we're creating executables here, and that's kind of like the default location where it goes. Right? So there's a debugging executable. There's also like a release version, and you can build a release version of your code that's going to, run in a more efficient manner. Okay? But that's kind of like the default where your executable is. Now, here we've got our all these windows. We've got a lot of windows going on here. And these windows are kind of important. So let's look at these windows, and let's look at common things that go on with these windows. So this window here is called Solution Explorer. Everyone can kind of see Solution Explorer. This is where we open remember, solution has multiple projects. So if we want to go from solution to solution, or if we want to add projects to the solution, that's all done in Solution Explorer. Okay? You got, of course, the pin button where it kind of hides it. See that? If I pin it down, then it kind of puts it there. If I auto hide it, it puts it over in a tab over here. So this pin right here kind of changes our layout a little bit and what we see. It's the same thing for properties. We can auto hide properties and auto hide solution. Right? So there's properties and solutions. I'm going to leave those pinned because that's kind of the default. Okay. Over here on the left, see we got more tabs. We got Server Explorer. We will use this tab kind of later. So we don't need that for now, so I'm not going to pin that. We've got Toolbox. It's initializing. Give it a second. The toolbox are where your controls are going to be at. You notice, like, if I look here, this is where I can find my buttons. Did you notice I just, on my toolbox, I clicked on button and I dragged it over and I dropped it. I can delete it. Whether I'm working with buttons or I'm working with like a text box, if I scroll down, here's a label. Of course, I've got a text box on here. I can scroll down to my text box, dragging and dropping. One thing about Visual Studio, there's like 4 ways to do anything. So just because I do it this way doesn't mean you have to. If you can find another way to whatever, you can. I'm fine with it. Of course, you could just like double click things. Like if you just double click a text box, it'll add it. See, and that's kind of like what the book will let you know is like there's 3 ways to do this. There's 4 ways to do that, and that's good. That's all fine and dandy. You just gotta know one way. For me, you just gotta know how to do it, right? But it's good to know multiple ways. So when we have these controls, these are all called controls. All these controls are on the toolbox. You start with just the form control. The form itself is a control. Okay? Notice down here, this drop box and your properties, these are all the controls that we've got. I've got a form control called Form 1. I've got a button control. Notice when I change a drop down, you notice it's highlighting the different controls. Can everyone see that? So, good practice number 1 is that as soon as you add a control, let's give it a good name. Text box 1 is not a good name for a control. Okay, like for this button 1, I'm going to change this to button 1. I click on button 1, you see it highlights button 1. Okay, let's look at some properties here. I can scroll on when I'm scrolling on down here in this properties windows, these are properties of the button. These are all things you can change about the button. What is the font that's on it? What's the font color? What's the dimensions of the button? Where's it at on the form? These are all properties of the button. Well, some very common properties, of course, the text. The text is what the user sees. So, of course, we could just say something like submit. So now the button says submit instead of button 1. That's good. So changing the text, very good. Let's also change the name. So you kind of got to scroll down into design. This is the name of the button. By the way, the default here, you can kind of see where my mouse is. These properties are in categories, but you can also sort the properties by alphabetical order. So you could change that. Instead of being by categories, they could just be by alphabetical order. So I'll just call this BTN submit. Now, the name of my button is one word, and it starts with 3 lowercase letters that represent what that control is. Okay, that's called a naming convention. Okay, that's going to be the naming convention for our controls. So I changed 2 things. I changed the name and I changed the text. Yeah? Let's go to the form and let's change the same things. Let's go to Form 1. So I changed the drop down to say Form 1. Let's change the name. Form Hello World. FRM. FRM Hello World. So that's the name. And the text will say Hello World Form. You see it kind of changes the title of the form, if you will. So when you change the text property of the form, it changes what's up in the in the title area of the form. I'll call it the title area. Let's go to our label. Here, now I could focus the label just by clicking on it or by changing it here. Doesn't matter. I'm going to change the label to say nothing. The label is going to be empty. And the name will be label LBL, I'll just call it label display. LBL display. You can kind of see where this is going. You'll notice here what I'm doing is I'm working in designer mode. So I'm designing my form. If you right-click the form and click on View Code, this is form1.cs. These are both form1.cs. One is the code for the form, and one is the designer. So again, what I did is I right-clicked and I viewed code. This is going to be where we're going to write our code, our C#. Now what I want to do is I want that label. Notice the label's gone. You can kind of highlight it and you can find it this way. But also you could just go here and select it in your properties. While we're at it, let's give our text box a name. The name of my text box, I'm just going to call it TXT username. Hang in there, Ryan. You got this. Now, the next step is just doing hello world. All I've really done is I've added some controls, I've changed some properties of some controls, but now I'm going to get this button to do something. To get the button to do something, the easiest way is just double click the button. Watch what happens when you double click the button. Notice over here, all this is in yellow. Okay? That means that this code has been added to the file and it's not been saved. So when you double click that button, basically lines 19 through 24 have been added. And actually the cursor was just sitting here flashing on line 22. So if you read this, it says private void button submit underscore click. So in between these two curly braces, this is where we're going to write the code that goes when the user clicks the button. This is called an event handler. Okay? The way to do this, remember we had a label. Our label was called label display. So I'm going to say label display dot text. Remember the text property? We deleted it. It says nothing. We're going to update the text property in code by saying label display dot text equals hello world semicolon. So the first thing that you see that writing command line apps and writing desktop apps, it's a little different. It's a little different. Do you think it's case sensitive?
Yeah.
Good guess. Good guess. You're correct. It is case sensitive. So if I name my label lowercase LBL capital display, by the way, they give that a name. That's called camel casing. You start with the lowercase letter, then every new word is capitalized. That camel casing. It's also very descriptive because you say what it is. LBL is a label. So the control type is the first word. So the control is labeled display. Dot text is the property. Equals is what's called, you're setting it equal to something. It's called the assignment operator. And then inside of quotes, I've got the word hello world. Okay, now just to run this, start without debugging. I got this big old form with a submit button. I click it and it says hello world.
Wait, how do you get to that?
Debug, start without debugging. Now again, remember right here, your drop down needs to say lab 2. Because if your drop down says lab 1, it's going to run this one, remember? So that's hello world command line. This is hello world GUI. Okay, so we've been doing this little lecture here. This says for about 40 minutes. Okay, I like to take little breaks to let people catch up and ask questions. Let you guys take a mental breather. Let's take a 10-minute break. I'm going to go pause the recording. Uh-oh, where's my pause button? OBS is... Uh-oh. There used to be a pause button. You guys take a break. Come back in 10 minutes.
Okay.
And if you got questions, I'll be right around to help you out, okay? So I'm going to click stop. That's not what I want. Settings, hotkeys, pause. Pause recording.
And it could be the file format you're recording in.
Yeah.
I know there's a bunch of there's like FP formats.
Yeah, it might be the file format. Yeah.
I got a question, Mr. Mine.
I'll be right there, sir. I'm going to hit Control P as my hotkey for pausing. Let's hit Control P.